Hi, my name is Sharky. You're listening to the Fifth Period podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Fifth Period, the podcast where each week two media teachers take a new film and talk story, symbol, likes, and dislikes. I'm Mr. Brown, and with me, as always, is my co-host,
Mr. Whittle. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be back here talking to you about a film that is very close to my heart. Very pleased when this suggestion got put forward the other week, and very excited to be talking to you about it.
So before we jump into the film today, just a special shout out to Sharky, who introduced today's episode. For those who don't know, our films each week are selected by students as part of our Film Appreciation Club at school, and Sharky is one of our regular attendees. Big Star Wars fan, he exhausted most of our Star Wars catalogue at Film Club last year.
Yes.
So this inclusion is one that we're going to be continuing to extend to all of our regulars.
It'd be lovely to have a range of students introducing the podcast over the upcoming weeks and months. So feel free to put your hand up and we'll come over to you at the end of Film Club Friday and put a phone in front of your face so that you can say hello to everyone and introduce the podcast.
Yeah, super intrusive of us. We'll stick that phone right in your face. So hopefully it's a bit of incentive to get people involved. If you have any creative intros for Wits and I, just make sure you get your best podcast voice all warmed up and ready to go.
So we have a great film this week. I've already thrown a bunch of superlatives at it, but I'm going to throw a few more at it over the upcoming chat. There's quite a few students that were pleased to be watching the film last Friday, but also quite a few students who had no idea about this film, which is interesting to me because it does have a mixed history in terms of a cult following, but also falling into the unknown category for what was a big film at the time.
Yeah, so for me personally, this was actually the first time I was watching Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which is our big film for the day. I had heard obviously a lot about it, I knew a lot about it, and I was very excited to watch it. If you'd asked me why I hadn't seen it up until this point, I'm not quite sure. I think it's one of those things where people are usually introduced to it at a younger age, and I might have just missed the boat on that one. But I was super, super keen when I heard that was what we were going to be discussing, because I knew a little bit about it before we went into it, and I was very excited for the film noir aspects that were going to come up.
Well, for me, I was very excited and for a very different reason. We used to watch this film quite a bit in the Mr. Whittle household. Well, not that we'd call it the Mr. Whittle household when I was a kid. Like, that'd be weird if my brother and sister were calling me Mr. Whittle. But
that's kind of why you became a teacher, right? Because you grew up in this household. There was all that pressure on you.
Yeah, it was always on the cards that I was going to be a teacher even at the age of 8. So, my brother, sister, and I used to watch this film on a very regular basis. And it's one of those films that when I did watch it for the revisit for this podcast, half of the lines, like I knew in advance, just... You get a beat and a rhythm going on when you start watching a film that you know that well. It just kind of all comes back to you.
Yeah, not surprising at all. There was certainly a lot of really, really fun moments throughout the film. So I could see how if you were familiar with this film growing up, it would be one of those ones that you could always come back to and was super quotable. I guess one thing that I really liked about it is it's a little bit ambiguous who it's aimed at, and I think that's to its credit. It definitely has elements that are aimed at younger kids, but some jokes that are quite clearly adult humor as well. And I think that's something that good kids films always do. I mean, they acknowledge that it's not just going to be children that are watching it. Often they're watching with their parents, so they want to make it appealing to their entire audience. And so, yeah, it just gives it a bit more of that rewatch value, and they can go back time and time again and find it just as engaging as their children do.
Yeah, I guess that's what makes a family-friendly film, where it can appeal to all of the viewers of the film and sitting down and watching it at the same time. Going back to it now was quite interesting. I didn't enjoy it as much as I did as a kid. That's not to say I didn't enjoy it, but it's just interesting to kind of reflect on how your memory of what a film is sometimes isn't actually what you would experience it to be at a later date, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I completely get what you mean. I was really keen to talk to you about it because I knew it was obviously something that you had a lot of nostalgia for. And I think that can always play a really big role in how you enjoy a film. And I was wondering how our opinions would differ on it based on someone who did grow up with it versus someone who was watching it a little bit later in life.
Well, I think what we'll do is maybe we'll tease on that, and then we'll come back to our final kind of view on it after we've broken the film down. Now, before we jump into talking about the film in depth, obviously the obligatory spoiler warning. This may be the point where you press pause on the podcast and go and watch the film. It's on Click View for our...
Disney Plus is what I watched it on.
Yes, Disney Plus, which we'll talk about in a second as to the Disney rights as well, because that's an interesting little aspect of the film. But yeah, please go and watch it. Or don't, but don't get angry at us if we spoil it for you, because we've amply warned you.
One thing that I'm pretty keen to talk about, I mean, ordinarily coming into the podcast, I usually take quite substantial notes as I'm watching the film through. And I think part of that is, for a lot of the films that we have watched previously, they're films that I'm super familiar with. I really want, I have a lot of opinions and a lot of things that I want to say about them. So it was really refreshing going into a film that I hadn't seen before and just sort of sitting back and appreciating it. I didn't take any notes throughout the film. Obviously, there were certain aspects that jumped out at me as things I wanted to discuss, but it was nice just watching a film for enjoyment. And there was a lot of things about it where I was really curious, I wonder how that happened behind the scenes. And I'm excited to chat to you about that today, because I believe you have some more insights into that, certainly than I do.
I am looking forward to, hopefully sometime soon, one of the students putting forward a film that I haven't seen yet, because out of the 5, this is the 5th one that we've tackled this year. I've seen all 5 previously, and I have no qualms with going back and revisiting films, but I do, more than anything, love sitting down and experiencing a film for the first time. Whether I love it or hate it, the actual experience of a new film is, as you know, and we'll talk about this in a bit later in the podcast. Should we save it to the end, I think?
We do have a new segment coming up. I guess we're trying a lot of new things this episode. We've got the intros by different students. We've also got a student-suggested new segment that we will touch on after the discussion of the film.
My adoration for watching something new will come into play a bit later in the podcast as well.
Yeah, I'm excited for that too. So lots of new things today, but I guess we'll jump straight into the film.
We are told that the film is called Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but then we go into a cartoon. Okay, now, even if you hadn't seen the film before, surely you've seen a poster, certainly you would have in 1988 when it came out, that showed you that the cartoon world was being portrayed within the real world as well. But then as an audience member, we start off with just a pure cartoon, which I was reminded when we watched this on Friday with the film club, how good a start that is to engage an audience, because there's nothing people love more than just a fun cartoon to just go, I'm in, I'm watching.
Look, I'm not someone who usually is ranking cartoons at the top of their favorites lists. I certainly have a lot of appreciation for them, but they're not my go-to.
No.
And so it was really interesting because obviously I hadn't seen the film before. As soon as it started, I was immediately sucked into it. So it's just a testament to how well it's done. So many familiar elements. Obviously, they're trying to take things within the film, trying to take the film noir style, trying to take the cartoon style and merge them together. And to do that effectively, they have to really touch on all of the familiar tropes. Parents just being portrayed as legs in the cartoon from Charlie Brown. It's never really focused on them. It's all about the other characters.
Yeah, and then the ultra violent, the escapades of trying to save the baby. It really leans into all of those classic Looney Tunes style. I will admit I did do a bit of research on this film, which I haven't always done on the previous films, but it did come to my attention that they did try and make Roger very much a Looney Tunes kind of character. They wanted Roger to come across in a very eccentric manner, which I think he does, and really kind of wily in nature. And so they wanted him to really portray those classics of like the Daffy Ducks, the Bugs Bunnies, the Yosemite Sams, Porky Pig, that kind of manic nature. And so I think they succeed as well.
I really found it quite interesting how, as you said, the ultra violence. It is a really violent cartoon, but it's portrayed in such an innocent way. It's so interesting how I mean, that was such a staple of cartoons as well.
Especially in that era, because this film is set in the mid-50s, and that was really at a peak for the cartoons of Looney Tunes and Disney coming forward and being very popular at the time.
Yeah, and there's a lot of kind of meta humor about that as well. I mean, whenever you're portraying cartoons as existing within the real world, there's always going to be some meta humor involved in that.
Yeah.
But I loved that stuff, that kind of breaking the fourth wall element.
And then obviously that's what occurs, sorry, not breaking the fourth wall, but then we break out of the cartoon into the world of the film when Roger can't produce stars, he produces birds instead, and baby Herman storms off to his trailer with his stogie.
Yeah, I love his voice too.
Yeah.
It's like he's been smoking cigars day after day after day. He's got that really husky voice.
Yeah. And so that introduction of characters is important, but then we move into meeting Eddie Valiant, and then we move really into the film noir kind of narrative as well, which really, I do believe, dominates the film in terms of what kind of film it's trying to be.
Yeah, so
it is a noir.
As I said, there is a bit of ambiguity as to who the film is for. I feel like the clearest divide is the divide between live action and cartoon. When things are being shown in cartoon, for the most part, those are for kids. And when things are being shown in live action, that seems to have more appeal for your older audience.
Yes.
I certainly don't think the film noir tropes that come up in the narrative are ones that younger kids are going to understand. Whereas for me, watching it, those are my favorite parts.
Yeah. It's interesting because if I think back to how, and obviously it's hard to look back and know exactly, but if I try and think back to how I experienced the story as a kid, without knowing it was film noir and what tropes it leaned into, you still kind of knew essentially that it was trying to be something. It was trying to be a story about an angry, bitter man who had a traumatized past. By the way, if any of our Year 9 media students are listening, all of this should be very relevant to you right now because we've been talking codes and conventions of film noir throughout the last few weeks. So I will admit that prior to teaching this unit of work, I wasn't as aware as I am now. So when I list these out, I'm like, we're just checking boxes of what you'd expect to be in a film noir.
Well, yeah. I mean, last week we were talking about Back to the Future, which was our Year 8 film analysis, and this week we're talking film noir. So ticking all the boxes. We'll move on to mockumentaries next, just so that we can help our Year 10s out.
Very good.
But you're right. Yeah, the conventions they're laid on really thick in this because it is somewhat of a parody of noir as well. So it needs to have those really identifiable qualities. And the fact that you have a tragic backstory for your leading character, so Eddie's tragic backstory of his brother being killed by a toon.
Dropped a piano
on him. So good. But also the fact that as a result of that now, he's not overly likable. He's got a bit of a temper. He drinks heavily. Like that tortured kind of character as well. That's a super familiar trope of the noir genre. So I feel like they do a really good job of merging the two worlds together and making it still feel like noir, still feel like you can identify the qualities that would come up in noir, but they almost soften them a little. They lessen them so that it still feels like it's cohesive with the cartoon world.
Yeah, for sure. And I think just purely having the cartoons living in the world of that 50s Hollywood helps. But even that aside, there's some levity that comes in through what Eddie Valiant, the protagonist character, does that allows us to have him be a bit more accessible than what maybe a straight down the line film noir would be. Him jumping on the back of the tram, you know, and
helping the kid on.
A bit of loving, comes in for Eddie when he does that.
And that's the thing too. So it's not often in a noir that the leading character is all that likable because they have this tortured past. It's almost an excuse for them to act like a bit of a jerk throughout the film. But they give Eddie redeeming qualities because kids don't necessarily want to follow someone that's not very likable. So they give him redeeming qualities so that throughout the film, he can kind of come back from the darkness, back from the shadows.
So we're instantly sympathizing with him because of his brother and the traumatic past there. but he's also got heart, like the way he talks with Dolores at the bar as well. They've obviously got a conflicted relationship, but they still have a relationship. They're still like fond of each other, essentially.
Yet another familiar element of Noir. The detective has love interests, sometimes multiple love interests, that often more interested in him than he is in them.
Yes.
He kind of shrugs them off, or he's too focused on something else to pay them the attention that they deserve. And I love Dolores as a character. She's so great.
Oh, absolutely. She's a lot of fun. Just the delivery, and she holds him accountable for being a good human.
But she's also got this sort of no-nonsense attitude.
Yep.
So if he tries to put something forward, she's like, yeah, and just kind of shrugs it off.
Yeah, but she's also still very caring when she needs to be. Like she wants him to do well, and will look after him and give him the camera and help him out when Roger's there with the handcuffs and all that stuff. So she's a very interesting character. We have skipped over an important scene to discuss, which is when Eddie is leaving the Maroon Toons studios. So he sees the broomsticks from Fantasia.
So good. But they're holding their own brooms and sweeping up to the tune from Fantasia.
Yeah. That scene alone was one of the hardest for them to produce, because if you watch it with detail, there's a lot of interaction with the cartoons, which doesn't happen as much throughout, but it's a real setup for us to feel that the world is occurring. So that having the layers there, they actually talked about because they used a lot of still photos to paint in the cartoons. The stack of still photos was 8 foot high in the offices of Touchstone Pictures.
Yeah, well, it's funny you say the layering, because that was, as media teachers, and we produce our own content as well, that was one of the things that really stood out to me, that it's not always a tune in front of...
You did it.
I did do. In front of live action. Sometimes it's live action in front of them. And just the fact that you can have 5 or 6 layers, and they might alternate between the drawn cartoons and the live action people. Even looking at that now, one of the most interesting things when I watch this through and I see certain special effects is I don't necessarily know, without looking at behind the scenes stuff, I don't necessarily know how they did it back then, but I just try and think, how easy would that be to do now? And even that is something that's really, really tricky. Often when you look at special effects, you go, it would have been tricky back then, but now you can do it with this simple click of a button. But that kind of layering is so complex. Yeah. And beyond the actual effects themselves, the performances.
Correct. So Bob Hoskins, the actor who played Eddie Valiant, has said in an interview that he did a good portion of this film in front of a green screen and just talking to the air. Or they'd have a stand-in kind of mock-up of Roger or something like that, just so he felt some realism for it while he was delivering his lines.
This is, of course, Bob Hoskins of Super Mario Brothers fame. I wonder if he did any of that kind of green screen stuff in that film.
If I recall correctly, a lot more sets as opposed to... Yeah, the integration of the cartoons for Who Framed Roger Rabbit goes down as the most expensive film made in the 80s.
Is that right?
Yeah, so that's a big fun fact where $70 million this film cost to make. It did make it back just fine, but that's a big number. And then it's okay, so there was a lot of big films made in the 80s, but this one was the most expensive.
Yeah, there were a lot of big films, and we've covered half of them for our film club already.
Yeah. So this is more than Back to the Future.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Which, by the way, we haven't dropped his name. Robert Zemeckis is the director of this film. He's also the director of Back to the Future series. So we are on a Zemeckis fest right now.
Well, it's interesting you say that. As I was watching this through, started playing a bit of 6 Degrees of Separation between all of our films. We had Strickland from Top Gun tying over into Back to the Future, and now we've got Christopher Lloyd from Back to the Future tying over into this.
That's a great game to play. So we'll call it out now to whoever's listened to the podcast. If you can connect the first 5 films in 6 degrees or less, we'll have some kind of prize for you at Film Club, I reckon.
For people who don't know, 6 Degrees of Separation is also known fondly as 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. You link different films together by connecting the actors that have appeared within those films. So if you can do that, bring it back to us, we will be very, very impressed.
Yes. So I've dropped his name a bunch of times, but can we just take a minute to recognise and savour the fact that Eddie Valiant is a fantastic character name.
Oh, and such a noir name, but also it comes back to what we were discussing for the Truman Show about the symbolism within names.
Yes.
So he's a valiant character,
Yes.
or he maybe not at the time that he's introduced, but when they're recalling him doing work with his brother, they were both seen as valiant because they are the Valiant brothers.
Yes. So I love his name. I love Dolores as a name as well. I think I made that point to you as we were watching it in Film Club. I just it's such a noir name as well. It's just got that, it rings of the era. But yeah, with Eddie Valiant, Bob Hoskins as that character is just so on point. There was a bunch of people that were considered for that role, and what I like about Bob Hoskins delivering that character is that he's quite understated and just he really kind of nicely contrasts the craziness that's going on around him, and which is what he wanted, what he would have been expected to do. But I just think he does it really well.
Even when he's first introduced and he just kind of shrugs off all the madness around him and just goes, "Toons."
Yeah.
You're just like, all right, I'm in. I can get behind this guy.
Yeah.
Great.
So, Valiant takes the job of finding out what's happening, and then he...
Yeah, so essentially he's hired to prove that Jessica Rabbit's not a good person.
Yes.
So that her and Roger Rabbit will separate and he can get back in the zone for his film career because his performance has gone downhill.
Which, I love all of it. I love that there's the whole, it'll cost you $100 to do the job, and Maroon's like, $100? What a ripoff kind of thing. So $100 was big money back in the 50s.
That was always the thing if you watch old noirs from the 40s and 50s, detectives in those films will be like, oh, my salary is $5 a day. And you're like, whoo!
Yes.
It's pricey. It's pricey stuff.
Then he heads down to I think it's called the Ink and Spot Club, something like that. Riley will correct us on this because he told me it on Friday. He heads down to the club, and then, so while we were watching the film on Friday, guys, Mr. Brown leaned over to me and goes, "So is Jessica Rabbit really a rabbit, or is
this
it
was
just
before she'd been introduced, mind you.
Yeah. Legitimate question. I'm not mocking, but I think it's nice to just call it out now that Jessica Rabbit's not a rabbit.
No.
Yep, she is a very sultry, standard human kind of cartoon.
Well, I guess she's the femme fatale in the film.
Definitely the femme fatale.
But also, the femme fatale is usually the one that ends up betraying the detective.
Yes.
And in the end, she's not the one that betrays him.
I wanted to ask you about this. So, can a femme fatale be a foil to who is the true villain in a film noir and still be called that then?
Yes.
Yeah.
So basically the reasoning behind being called the femme fatale is that they are the fatal vice for the detective type character. So if they use their charm to manipulate the detective into doing something and then effectively betray him, then they can be considered the femme fatale. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be the biggest threat of the film or even be working for the biggest threat of the film. But if at some stage throughout the narrative she betrays him, then she can be considered a femme fatale.
Which Jessica Rabbit does do to Valiant, but even though she was forced into the lie of she had to put on the patty cake.
The patty cake. I've been so keen to talk about this.
She admits to him later on when she goes to his apartment that he was set up to take those photos. She was forced into posing for the patty cake tomfoolery with Mr. Acme, who is the owner of Toon Town, and she did it to save Roger because he was going to lose his opportunity to work in Hollywood ever again.
Yeah, I feel like this is a great time to point out that the plot is needlessly complicated. Well, maybe not needlessly. I guess if it's paying homage to film noir, then complicated webs of ulterior motives and elaborate plot points and all of that really does play into what a film noir is. But if you do look at it through the lens of a kid's film, then it is very, very complicated. And it made me think when I was watching it, how many films did I watch as a kid and not necessarily know everything that was going on, understand it, but there was enough that I could kind of go, oh, I get it.
Yeah, you get it. He's got to go do this.
He's got to do
now.
something.
Yeah. Interesting you bring that up because I did think I'm not the best at following plot points. Okay, I will admit that someone will say to me after I've watched the film, "Oh, did you notice this part of the story?" And I'm like, "Nope." And like it's just because I have experienced the film in a different way, but I was doing okay with following this plot compared to other film noir. So if we talk about Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid for a minute, like I feel like that story is way more convoluted. Now, there's a reason why, because they're trying to shoehorn in all those
cameos.
Cameos, yes.
Yeah, so this is the film that Mr. Whittle has just brought up is another film noir parody.
Yes.
It's a Steve Martin film. I adore it. And it is really exaggerated and really over the top and really complex because it is a parody and because it is poking fun at film noir, but also because in a really interesting kind of twist, the film is made up of a lot of different film noir movies from back in the late 30s, early 40s, maybe even late 40s and early 50s. I'm not sure how far they span, but they have stock footage from a bunch of old films. And they have put them in and had the cast members of this film play opposite characters from this stock footage. So it is very elaborate and exaggerated and over the top, but it's interesting that you said you found that complex because I feel like that is just go from one person who leads you to the next person, who leads you to the next person.
Yeah, maybe it was the structuring didn't appeal to me as much. I'm not too sure. But yeah, back to Roger Rabbit, like I did find that story was okay for me to follow. And what I did like about the story, which I do think you'll be able to clarify this for me, within film noir where much of the antagonist's drive comes from trying to obtain a monopoly over some form of social requirements. So for this film, they were talking about building the freeways. So knocking down Toon Town so that they could build these things called freeways. And Valiant's like, why would anyone want to use a freeway? And we all know, obviously, that people use freeways, so that's the joke, right? But it did remind me of what goes down as one of the first neo-noir films, which is Chinatown. And that had a very similar story where it talks about the waterways. So that is a driving point for the narrative. It made it clear for me.
Yeah, well, I should clarify. You said I'll be able to answer that for you. I'm certainly no film noir expert. I love watching it. I love making film noir as well. So I'm very enthusiastic, but I wouldn't say that I'm an expert by any means, but it is definitely a familiar element that comes up because a lot of the villains within noir want power.
Yeah.
And so to be able to control something that a lot of people need as a requirement, that's a very easy way for them to gain that power. Now, sometimes in noir, it isn't a real thing that people necessarily need. That idea of a MacGuffin, this kind of fake narrative device that's introduced that everyone really wants, but as an audience, we don't care about.
Yeah.
I feel like the freeway somewhat acts as a MacGuffin in this particular film because we're like, yeah, who cares about the freeway? We just want Roger to be innocent. Often they do present this overarching idea of what the villain wants as a basis so that they can then tackle and shoehorn in all these other complex ideas. But if you go through the film scene by scene, you realize that everyone's got their own motives. So there's ulterior motives coming from every individual character. And that's part of the reason why it takes so long for Eddie to get to the bottom of the case because he thinks he's cracked it about 4 or 5 different times because he's figured out that someone's not being honest about something that they're doing. But in this world, in this dystopian society that is noir, no one's being honest because everybody wants something. And so they've all got their own ulterior motives.
Is that a common story convention for noir as well, to have
ulterior motives
for
sure.
Of multiple characters taking the protagonist off the track?
Exactly right. And that's why I said that a femme fatale isn't necessarily going to be associated with the main villain in noir. I mean, the detective character is getting betrayed by people left, right, and center in noirs, whether it's connected to the main plot or not, because everybody's shady. Everybody has something to gain from screwing someone else over.
Right. talking about screwing people over and the antagonist drive would be a good segue into talking about the judge.
The judge.
So we did.
Great Scott.
Oh, mate. So like going from Back to the Future last week into this film, and what we also need to recognise that it's Robert Zemeckis who's done Back to the Future in 85, then this film in 88. By the time this film was getting released, he would have been well underway with production of Back to the Future 2 and 3, which you mentioned were recorded at the same time. So he's having a real run at these blockbuster films in the late 80s. But Christopher Lloyd, who plays Doc Brown in Back to the Future, comes in for this other Zemeckis film and plays the villain. He plays Judge Doom. What a great name. Let's just start with the name. Okay?
Yes, all right. So, again, symbolism in the name. Doom, he is the one that will bring about people's doom. He's the villain of the piece. Everything about him is menacing. He's got a big black trench coat, a big wide-brimmed black hat. He's got those teeth.
The teeth.
The capped teeth.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So, we obviously learn later on that he is, in fact, a cartoon. He has, he's so depicted in the film from the outset as something outlandish and cartoonish in the exaggerated nature of his black cape and the black hat and the pale skin and the teeth. And when we first meet him, the hyperbolic nature of his villainy is really put forward so that he ties in with this world of the noir, but he also has connections somehow with the cartoons, which I love that part as well, and his hatred for cartoons. Like when we first meet him and he picks up that clown shoe. And puts it in the dip.
It is so menacing.
It's
horrific.
I was still traumatized by that watching this the other day because it's like, there's no justification for it. He's just getting a cartoon. This poor animated personified shoe is getting dipped and killed. He's a judge that's been appointed this role. How can I ever justify this? There's no rationale given besides he just gets to kill things.
Yeah, and essentially it's anything that gets in his way, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the shoe has interfered with them solving the case because it jumped out of the box with all the other shoes.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, this is the consequence for not doing exactly what you're told.
Yeah. Wild. And then on top of Judge Doom is his 5 weasel sidekicks who are probably my favorite characters, as a group of characters.
Perfect symbolism again there. The Weasley characters are actually weasels.
Yes. Interesting tidbit, they were originally going to go with 7 of them to match the 7 dwarves
that's
of
fun.
Snow White. But then they decided to cull it back and just make it 5. But those weasels, that scene where they come to Eddie's apartment and Roger's handcuffed to Eddie.
In the sink?
In the sink.
Yeah, right.
And the menacing nature of those weasels as they try and find Roger, and then they're laughing, and then that stop laughing. It's just I remember as a kid being really switched on in terms of the eeriness of those characters. And it's not anything really super scary, but there was something that just really triggered me as a kid with those villains.
I like that they've all got color coordination, they've all got their individual color,
yes.
and that they're wearing zoot suits and suits of the time.
Yes, for sure.
They're just they're stylish villains. You could easily picture them fitting into a regular noir. It's just a really clever way to meld the two worlds together.
Yeah.
Yeah, which this film is obviously fantastic at doing. We've got to talk about patty cake, right?
Yes. So we're referring to when Valiant finds the Jessica Rabbit and Mr. Acme, I think his name is.
Playing patty cake.
Yeah, playing patty cake.
And obviously the whole reason he's been hired is to prove that she's being unfaithful to Roger. And in this world, the version of being unfaithful is for them to be playing patty cake with one another rather than them sleeping together. But the way that the scene is done is brilliant. Obviously, it was the first time I'd seen it. We see him looking through the window. We hear the noise of what's going on in the room. And I was like, is this are they actually suggesting that the two of these characters are sleeping together in this children's film? And then when it cuts to them showing the photos of them playing patty cake, it was just a brilliant reveal.
Yes. And then obviously Roger getting the photos from Eddie and then flicking through them so much that it animates them while they're playing patty cake.
So clever.
It's good. All a lot of fun. But then we find out later that it was all a setup and that it was just that Jessica was being threatened and had to look after Roger, which then puts Jessica in a position. Although there are a few more moments later on in the film where you do question her what side she's on, but ultimately you kind of know that Jessica's playing for the right side, the good side.
Yeah, it's interesting too because she's voiced by Kathleen Turner.
Yes.
Her singing is done by another actress whose name escapes me. But Kathleen Turner, at this point in her career, was really known for playing these types of characters. She's in another movie called Body Heat with William Hurt, where she does play this seductive type character. And the entire time you question whether she's being faithful to the leading man or whether she's actually got ulterior motives. So just a brilliant choice of person to play the role because she was so synonymous with this type of character.
How did you find out that Kathleen Turner was playing the role? Because she actually didn't want to be actively credited for the role. So I'm not too sure
there you go.
What the backstory is as to why, whether she didn't agree with the depiction of Jessica Rabbit in the end or whether she just wanted to remain hidden. But yeah, if you go to the IMDb page of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, she's not officially credited.
Is that right?
We do know it through the Wikipedia and just through knowing trivia, right, that it was Kathleen Turner.
Wow, yeah. I mean, I'd say these days it's a lot harder to conceal that stuff.
Yes.
Maybe when a film is first released, you can request that you're not credited, but with the internet these days, I mean, everything pops up immediately.
Yeah.
For me personally, as I said, I didn't write notes or anything for the film. I recognized her voice and then confirmed it by looking it up.
Yeah, for sure.
She has a very identifiable
She does, sultry kind of voice.
Yeah.
So bit of back and forth with Eddie kind of getting taken down different paths for where the story leads him to, but it does ultimately lead him to having to enter Toon Town. I wouldn't mind jumping ahead to this point because I do feel like that middle act of the film is great. Like there's a lot of great stuff that happens in it, but really it's just about Eddie getting steered down different paths. Yeah.
Oh, look, I'm definitely happy to skip ahead. I mean, it's such a fun film. I really want to rewatch as I'm going through it now. I'm like, oh yeah, I want to check that out again. So if we've missed anything that you love, please let us know below, and it'll force us to reflect on skimming through the narrative.
See, one of the things I love is when he decides he has to go into Toon Town, so he gets out his cartoon gun and the 6-shooter. And then he reveals his old bullets that clearly hadn't seen the light of day for quite some time.
Yep.
They're yawning as they wake up. And then they're like, howdy, partner. And like they all were different characters. Those bullets are some of my favorite characters in the film. They're just a lot of fun. They go around the wrong corner.
So good.
They're old senile bullets. And I just love that so much. But yeah, that entrance into Toon Town is iconic for kids who grew up watching this film. The point when Eddie goes into Toon Town, it's just contrasting of the world that he's come from. But then again, it leans into those film noir tropes of going into a more rundown or a different part of town. Yeah.
I mean, it still kind of follows the idea of him going around wrong corners. And as you said, it's very seedy, but even like him thinking he's on the right track and then ending up being on the wrong track, which is a plot device throughout the entire narrative. But it happens even in that simple moment where he thinks he's located Jessica Rabbit and it turns out to be the other redheaded character in the red dress. Just fun moments like that. So it's almost like it starts off and when he enters Toon Town, it's a really happy kind of vibe and it quite quickly goes from a dreamlike state to a nightmare.
Yes. Eddie is in his own nightmare in terms of being in Toon Town. Like at that point, he hasn't kind of come to accept the Toon Town. So for it to be annoying to him and menacing really kind of connects with what Eddie's feelings are towards Toon Town.
Yeah, and we get some more familiar characters. We get Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny.
So, a point of that, so obviously earlier on in the club, Donald Duck and Daffy Duck are on stage. So we have a Disney character and a Warner Brothers character doing screen time. Now, what the agreement was, because it was made by Touchstone Pictures, which is owned by Disney, so it's ultimately a Disney product that we're watching. So the agreement was made with Warner Brothers that the only way they'd allow for these things to occur is if there was an equal amount of speaking roles for each of their main characters. So Donald Duck had to have Daffy Duck had to have the same amount of speaking for Donald as Donald has. So they made it that the characters were on the screen at the same time, and the same goes for Mickey and Bugs.
I love that their way of doing the characters have the same amount of lines is we'll bring them in at exactly the same time and we'll just make them alternate their lines.
Yes. I love that whole sequence, that whole Eddie going through trying to find... Is he trying to find Roger at that point, or is he just trying to find Jessica?
Trying to find Jessica.
Yeah,
because he doesn't even know that Roger was in the boot of the car until after that. Yeah.
Yes, until Jessica tells him.
It's an interesting choice to include those characters as he's falling, because we have just seen a bit of a nightmarish vision. It's almost like a moment of levity. So it's like, don't worry, kids, it's still happy. Here's some familiar faces for you. Here's some characters that you recognize.
Yeah, so, and then we get to, back to main LA, and then we have the final scene where Judge Doom holds Roger and Jessica hostage, and then...
does the classic villain thing of, this is my whole plan, let me explain it to you, just in case you didn't understand it.
And we haven't touched on his way of killing Toons too much, which is that dip. The dip, it's called.
The dip, yeah.
Which is just a concoction of different chemicals. But when Jessica says, oh my God, it's dip, like I just, in my head, I'm like, I'm now going to have to say that line every time Mr. Brown pulls out some dip when I'm at his house for a snack. You know, just oh my God, it's dip.
And I'll be disappointed if you don't say that line.
Yes. But yeah, when then the weasels die. That's right. I love the weasels dying of laughter. Like, I love that cartoons have to be cautious of laughing too much. Otherwise, they will die of laughter.
I am 100% with you there in terms of the way they die. Perfect. I'm not a huge fan of Bob Hoskins dancing around and being silly.
That was awkward.
It is awkward, and I wonder if that's something that through the lens of a child is a great sequence. But I'm not sure. Like, earlier when Roger's doing the same thing, I was like, yep, I'm totally on board. I'm with it. But I don't know. I don't know if the comedy is there in that particular time. So I'd be really curious to check in with, wow, as you said, Riley's a huge fan. I'd love to know what he thinks of that particular scene.
But I must admit, like, the weasel's dying off, and then the final weasel dies, but he still flicks the switch as he's going up into the heavens. And then we have Judge Doom's reveal as a cartoon. So prior to how we are told he's a cartoon is, hands down, I think, the most traumatic scene as a child I witnessed in the 80s, which is watching a man get squashed with like a roller, like steamroller machine. The shrieking that Christopher Lloyd delivers as Judge Doom getting rolled over it still haunts me. And then when I watched it the other day, I'm like, I remember being traumatized by this scene.
It's interesting you say that, because I was always very familiar with the fact that he was a cartoon. I feel like I read it on like one of those children's films that are really, really traumatizing, like one of those top 10 countdown lists or something. And people always said that the moment that it's revealed that he's human, but he's got the cartoon eyes, that's supposed to be like the big scary moment.
I mean, so it is scary, but it's not as traumatizing as watching like a human man getting squashed. Like what a way to go. So I remember as a kid being impacted by that for sure. But then we find out he's a cartoon, so it's okay.
It's okay, yeah. Well, I mean, it's pretty traumatizing, as you said, when the cartoons die as well. A clown shoe, anyone?
Yes.
But still, I really like the fact that he is a cartoon. To me, it sort of speaks to, because he obviously has a hatred for cartoons, but he himself is one. Mm-hmm. It speaks to the idea of
like self-loathing.
Yeah. And it's actually not that uncommon for a villain to be vindictive to their own kind. Mm-hmm. It's quite interesting in terms of like he wants to destroy them all, and so then effectively he'll be the only toon left.
But he doesn't get away with it.
No.
They find a way to get him to melt like he is the Wicked Witch of the West.
With the high pitched voice works quite nicely with that. So that high pitched voice is freaky.
Yes, yeah, a lot of freakiness going on. Where like I love to look back on films of my youth, but also just to films of the era and go, what were we more than happy for kids to sit in front of compared to now? Like, are we more sensitive, less sensitive? There's some haunting kind of imagery in this movie.
I'm merely speculating. I would say films aimed at children are less daring in terms of what they present on screen. And so perhaps as a result of that, then we would be more sensitive now because we're not necessarily exposed to as much. Yeah. But that being said, I mean, that brings us into a much bigger discussion of, well, what are you exposed to? I mean, I'm sure there are some kids that are watching MA, R. Like, it's all about what you grow up with, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Children's programs are generally softer these days. Yeah. That doesn't necessarily mean that we as people are. So it's an interesting discussion, but it's much bigger than our little podcast, hey?
True. Yes. We can have maybe a shoot-off podcast where we go into the Classification Board of Australia and its history. Clearly, Zemeckis and Co. decided to go more with a family-friendly ending. I mean, they literally walk off into the sunset, the cartoon sunset, no less. So, they obviously wanted to go with the super happy ending on it.
I found it really interesting too that during that sunset bit, they're walking into a circle in the hole in the wall, and then you get the yeah, that's all, folks, which is clearly the Looney Tunes nod at the end.
Absolutely.
Talking about that final sequence, the battle. Who is the composer for this film?
I think this one was also Alan Silvestri.
Thank you. Yeah. That is the name I was looking for. All I could think of in that final battle was how similar some of the tunes sounded to some things we'd heard in Back to the Future the week earlier.
Yeah, and I felt the same way, that it was in the final act that the music really resembled Back to the Future. So you could certainly hear that Zemeckis has gone with the same composer, which he's done with a bunch of films.
I was watching that final scene and I was like, man, I need to watch Back to the Future again. It's been a whole week.
Yeah. Yes.
The other things that I really wanted to touch on were just like the really fun moments they had with it. The fact that he's paying Dumbo peanuts.
Yes.
It's like peanuts being an expression for paying them nothing.
There's so many little Easter eggs through this. So at the club, when Jessica Rabbit comes on stage, the band that's playing with her are the Crows from Dumbo.
Well, these are the controversial Crows from Dumbo.
The controversial Crows. Yeah. So for them to then be the band that Jessica has makes sense.
I liked that they would deliver really silly dialogue really seriously, like hard-boiled vibe. And I think the best one is when Dolores says how his brother died, dropped a piano on him.
I love it.
And that's why I said, like, I'm super keen to go back and rewatch. But I must say, it was really, really refreshing to watch a film for the first time and just be drawn into the world. And what a world. All the sets were phenomenal.
Yes.
Like, the attention to detail when he's in just an alley. Everything really draws you in.
I just realised I've been referring to Eddie's apartment, but did it double as his office with his brother?
Yes, which is pretty common for Noir as well, because the detective is not necessarily someone who's well off. Their office, and they have like a fold-out bed or a back room that's got a bed in it.
But the detail of production design within that set alone is just awesome, because it's got the little kitchenette off to the side where they're able to do the scene where Roger's in the sink. I just love all of that. So
yeah, and like the fact that his partner used to work there as well, or his brother, sorry, and partner.
Don't sit in that chair.
Everything's coated in dust.
Yes.
Like he hasn't touched it. And
So I feel like we've covered off a lot, and we have talked like very fondly about a lot of the film. But what's your ultimate kind of verdict on it? Did you enjoy it thoroughly, somewhat?
I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Like, there's no doubt that I enjoyed it. It probably, for me, it would have been one that relies on nostalgia a little bit.
Yes.
Which is why I was so keen to talk to you about it as someone who grew up with it. There were a lot of aspects of the film that appealed to me, whereas if you weren't as into film noir as I was, the narrative itself probably wouldn't draw you in as much.
Yeah.
So there were some visual elements and stylistic elements that got me really hyped for the film. And as I was watching it through, I was like, it's delivering on all of those kind of check boxes for me specifically. But I don't know that it holds up as a film that you would just watch as an adult if you didn't inherently have an interest in cartoons or noir.
Yeah.
So I really liked it, but I don't think that that's something that you could say across the board for people coming in and watching it in their late 20s.
Yes, yeah. So someone coming into it new without the rose-coloured glasses of nostalgia for their childhood probably wouldn't appreciate it as much as maybe I would. That said, certainly came out of it not having as enjoyed it as much as I did as a kid, but that's okay. Like, that's what these films often do. I will say the same for Top Gun. More so for Top Gun. But yeah, I think it's films that when you go back to them after 20, 30 years, you're obviously bringing a different version of yourself to it, but the film itself will do different things than what it did at that time. So you'll understand things a bit differently. You'll look at things a bit differently. Experience and individuality had an influence on me and how I appreciated the film.
Yeah. And I mean, I was discussing with you earlier today about the potential towards the end of the term to do a ranking of the films that we've watched for the term. And I think a ranking like that is a really good insight into our personal preference when it comes to film.
Yeah.
Especially because we do find a lot of them are held in quite high esteem for us. So it's interesting to go, well, it's not necessarily worse, it's just less best.
Yeah. Well, I've got nothing more to say on Who Framed Roger Rabbit. I think looking at it through the lens of knowledge of a media teacher who has just pretty much wrapped up, or is wrapping up his film noir unit for his Year 9 media class, really kind of gave me a new look at it as well. So yeah, I really enjoyed the experience this week.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've made it very, very clear how passionate I am about noir, and that was a really big selling point for me. So, hopefully a lot more films like this to come where I haven't seen them before and I can just watch them with fresh eyes and kind of take them in for the enjoyment of it rather than trying to dig a little deeper for meaning.
Please give us some recommendations for films at Film Club. We have a couple coming up that we're considering, a couple of recommendations that students have put forward. But please, the more the merrier. And I'll tell you now, if you do put one forward that is of a film that I haven't seen, I'm going to personally prioritize it because I too want to go through the experience that Mr. Brown is referring to, where getting to watch something new is always a bit of fun.
Yeah, and speaking of our audience, we did promise you at the start of today's episode that we will be delving into a new segment. Now, this was one that was suggested to us by another regular of ours. Shout out to Javier for this recommendation.
Javier,
yes, his French exchange student with the same name, Javier. He suggested that we do a discussion of the films or TV shows that we have watched in the past week and just give a bit of a rundown of if we would recommend them to you. So I should clarify for this segment, we won't be delving into any major plot details or any spoilers or anything like that. So you can comfortably listen if we are mentioning things that you have not yet seen. We won't be revealing anything too major about them.
Now, this is obviously on top of the film that we've watched for the podcast. So
it would be strange if for this segment we jump straight back into Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
We watch Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Yeah, so great week to bring in the segment because for two different reasons, Mr. Brown and I are very excited to list out what we watched. So for me, because it was the Academy Awards, I did a bit of work over the weekend catching up on a bunch of pending films because I'm a bit of a completist when it comes to all the nominations for the Academy Awards. Mr. Brown and I have had extensive conversations around how the Academy Awards is a very limited view on a year past as to what the quality films were. But I do like to look at it as a list of films that more often than not have merit in terms of checking out.
Yeah, I guess when it comes to the Academy Awards, quality of film is always going to be something that's very subjective. It's a certain section of film. And what some people see as quality of film versus other people is obviously going to be very, very different. So
yes.
Often I find that a lot of the films that are nominated for Academy Awards aren't necessarily films that I'm personally interested in. And that's not to say I watch them and then don't like them. For some of them, I just am not interested in seeing them in the first place.
Yeah.
I mean, for us, we're constantly talking about films that we want to see, extensive lists of things that we have to tick off. So I personally am not a big believer in going and seeing a film that you're not interested in if there are 10, 20, 30 films that you are interested in seeing first.
So yeah, like just to reiterate that point, that we all only have a certain amount of minutes in our day and only that we can only commit so many of those minutes to seeing films. With that in mind, did you see which film got the most wins? My favourite film of 2022, Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Oh, there you go.
Which you've seen and you also appreciated.
Absolutely. That was one we could both agree very much deserved to be nominated for all of the awards.
Yeah, so we are going a bit tangential in our segment for a second, but just to put it out there, that film really resonated with me in 2022 to the point where I've watched it multiple times since, and I do rank it as one of my favourite films of all time, which is a rarity to like have a new film come in and go, yep, it's in there. It's in the list. It's in the top.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I'm sure Jave is impatiently tapping his foot away, waiting for us to talk about what we've watched this week.
Well, no, he's not because I already spoke to him about my list earlier today. But for the rest of you who wanted to know what I watched over the last week, I did go into the long weekend saying to Mr. Brown, I am going to watch at least one film a day over the 4 days.
Big commitment.
Yeah, but I ended up watching 6. So I got it done in a bit. So Friday night I watched Operation Fortune, the new Guy Ritchie film with
Jason Statham.
Jason Statham.
You got to talk about it in your Jason Statham voice.
Which was meh. Okay,
that's a shame.
It was fine. Like, it was good fun. It was the kind of silly fun that you expected the film to be, and the final act was really good. And Hugh Grant, I don't know if he's playing the same character that he played in The Gentleman, but it's certainly that same kind of character. You know, where it's the rich larrikin kind of vibe.
Ray, have a drink with me.
Yeah,
Ray.
that character.
Yeah,
I don't know if he's actually playing the same guy. I didn't check into that, but he's revisiting that character in terms of its type, and that was a lot of fun.
He's really skeezy, and he's very menacing, but not always by saying menacing things. I can't remember where the gag comes from, but it's like an idea of you talk about really innocent things in that voice, and all of a sudden it sounds like really threatening, like how's your mum? How's your mum doing? It's like, oh, that seems nice and caring, but because you're asking about my mum, are you going to hurt my mum? What's happening here? Or how's your legs? It's like, oh God, he's going to break my legs. It's like anything that they mention, once it's in that voice, it already sounds threatening.
Absolutely, that I could see that working very well. Then I visited the Academy favourite, Tar, which is Kate Blanchett being very Kate Blanchett.
As she's prone to do.
Yes, acting with a capital A. Her performance is fantastic in this film, but I felt like I was watching an actor act, if that makes sense. It was very much...
Well, then her performance wasn't fantastic.
Yeah, like it still was, but like I think I had heard too much about it beforehand. And this is the risk you run when you are a fiend on Letterboxd and you also listen to podcasts about films before you actually go and see the film.
Yeah,
So don't do it, guys. Don't listen to podcasts until you've watched the film.
It's too late. They're already here.
Empire of Light as well, which was the new Sam Mendes film. That was an Academy Award nom. And that was nice, about a rundown cinema in the 80s in England. Olivia Colman is always great. So I had fun with that one. Causeway was probably the highlight over the weekend. That was a soft drama film, very low budget. Jennifer Lawrence doing a great job. And then Brian Tyree Henry, I think that's his name. He plays a supporting actor in that film. And so that was probably the highlight of the weekend, Causeway. Finalised with Living, Bill Nye. So that was in a 50s period piece where he is found out he has terminal illness, and so he goes about changing his life. So it's very much a story that we know of. But Bill Nye is a great actor, so that kind of brought it up a little bit. It's not always that many films that I get to watch over a weekly period, so I was pretty happy to knock out quite a few.
Yeah, and I mean, you said earlier in this episode that you and I have quite different taste. And that is going to be very evident in the films that I list in contrast to the ones that you did. So for me, I've actually only seen two new films in the last week. I've just been watching some TV shows as well. On top of that, obviously, when you're balancing workload stuff, sometimes TV can be a much easier watch.
I mean, I'm more than happy to talk about the TV shows that I watch on top of those films.
Oh man, how do you find the time for it? Yeah. No, I'm very much in awe of the fact that you were able to watch that many films over the weekend. It's certainly something I wanted to do and just didn't get a chance to. But first up on my list is Knock at the Cabin. It just scraped in. I saw it early this week. That's the new M. Night Shyamalan Ding Dong film. I have mixed feelings about it, and I know you've seen Knock at the Cabin too, so by all means jump in with your opinions as well. For me, I feel it's certainly not one of his best. There are some great moments in it, but if you've watched any of the advertising for the film, I don't necessarily think that there's anything surprising about the film. It plays out very much like the trailers would lead you to believe, and it gets to a certain point in the film where you just go, okay, cool, this is what's happening for the film. I'm just waiting for it to play out.
Yep.
And so in a film that is trying to be suspenseful and trying to keep you on the edge of your seat, when you do just know, all right, it's going to end one of two ways, you just kind of twiddle your thumbs until you get there. So I think the performances were really good. I think that there were some really great moments of tension, but overall it didn't fully hook me.
I would wholeheartedly agree with everything you just said.
Yeah, and look, I'm not necessarily sure. I know often M. Night Shyamalan films have a sort of hidden meaning behind them, or at least a thematic meaning that they're trying to push forward. I'm not sure what the agenda for this particular film is. I think it can sometimes get a little bit lost in the narrative, so it's a little murky. But by all means, if you've watched and you want to fill me in on the very obvious details that I've missed, please do comment below. Next up, Scream. So Scream 6. I'm very, very happy to report that after waiting very much on the edge of my seat for that release, I even saw it at an early release. It was supposed to come out Friday, and I ended up seeing it Thursday night. Very, very satisfied with it as a film. That's not to suggest I want people to get their hopes up. Everyone wants kind of different things from those films, but as a very big Scream fan, I love all of the films in the franchise, some more than others. This one was certainly up there on my list. I don't really want to delve into plot points of it because I fear that gives things away. But as an addition for my recommendation for this film, it now is sitting in my ranking. So
the reveal.
The reveal, yes. So my ranking, and I've looked online at a lot of different people's rankings, and I don't think I've seen this exact
Just to clearly contextualise, you're talking about your ranking of the six
Scream films
that have come out to date.
Yeah, so I don't think anyone can dispute that at the top of the list is the original Scream film. The performances, what they was doing to the genre in terms of that meta kind of humor behind the slasher film, firmly puts it into first place. The sequel, Scream 2, is coming in at number 2. For me, I really think that these films are very character-driven, and I feel like the sequel film has, I guess, the most characters that resemble the cast from the original. And so that really, really helps kind of shape the film. Obviously, when you're watching a franchise where characters are getting picked off, if you really like the cast in the first film, then each film you're going to have less and less of those characters to follow on from. So, really, really like the second film, and also like that was the film that kind of introduced the idea of a film within a film and turning Scream into the Stab franchise within the Scream universe.
Yes, that's right, which was fun.
A revolutionary idea. Yeah. Coming in at number 3 is Scream 6. So the new film is now in my top 3 of the 6.
Wow, okay, that's saying something. Like Mr. Brown and I have talked about the Scream films in detail, and knowing that it has pushed in front of all of the others that sit at varying... So let me guess. Can I guess what the order is of the other 3?
By all means.
So you've gone Scream 1 at 1, Scream 2 at 2, Scream 6 at 3rd spot.
Yes.
Then I reckon, because you and I both heavily appreciated the Scream 5, which is just called Scream.
Yeah.
So it
should have been called 5 Cream, though.
Well, I reckon that would be in number 4.
It actually isn't, but it has kind of had that spot. Number 4 and number 5 for me. I do go back and forth between them.
So the third one you've got at the bottom of the 6.
I do,
right?
And that's firmly locked into play. 1 at the top and 3 at the bottom has always been the standings. Look, I think there's good things in all of them. There's areas of improvement in all of them as well, but as someone who's been a huge fan of the franchise, it's always going to be one of those things where I scrutinize it a lot more than other people are.
Yeah.
And because of that, the rankings do tend to shift back and forth. So I'll be very, very keen to rewatch the new one and then see how it holds up on a second screening.
Well, as we discussed over coffee this morning, I think you've incentivized me to, well, not incentivized me, but encouraged me to go and check out Scream 6 at the cinemas.
For
sure.
It's
not the kind of film that I would normally go and spend the money on to sit at the cinemas for, but that I'm very excited to watch it still. I really enjoyed the revamp of Scream 5. So I think I'll have to check this one out at the movies as well.
Yeah, for sure. Alrighty, so with that, I will just quickly mention the 2 newer TV shows. I mean, I watched a lot of TV this week, but the 2 newer TV shows that I was checking out, I've always got Taskmaster playing in the background. It's a British kind of panel show where comedians come on and complete different tasks and then get scored on those tasks. Very, very fun. Please check it out if you haven't already. It's one of my all-time favorites. It's a very easy watch. But I was checking out some of the newer seasons of that. They basically release 2 seasons of that a year. So it's one of those ones where I can go back to it and rely on it. It's my safe TV show.
And there's always a new episode or 2 for you to watch.
Exactly right. Or you just go back to the start and watch them through from the beginning. But the other thing that I checked out, they released part 2. You're familiar with the TV show You on Netflix?
I am familiar with it. I haven't watched it though.
Right. Yeah. I don't necessarily think that you would like it. It's a little cheesy at times, but it is interesting to present a television show from the perspective of the villain. Mm-hmm. And since you're studying villains with your year 11s, it might be an interesting character study for you to check out an episode or 2. But I think the thing that I really wanted to comment on, they did a sort of mid-season break, similar to what they did for the latest season of Stranger Things.
Yes.
And it wasn't a very extended break, but I actually think that it was to the detriment of the series. So I was hooked. Penn Badgley does a great job in the the main role. And I think he does a really good job of taking a villain type character who does some absolutely terrible things, but almost justifying it to himself as that character. It makes it a very interesting watch. But I think that by splitting the season down the middle and having kind of like a month break between the release, it killed the momentum of it. So I was really hooked. I was really engaged with, what's going to happen next? And then I just sort of lost interest in that month. And so when I jumped back onto it in the last week, I was like, I remember how this was playing out. And I think I would have been a lot more drawn into the world if it had just flowed through. It's kind of like watching a movie over 2 days as opposed to watching it all in one sitting.
But because it's a Netflix show, did they do the drop of 5 episodes all at once?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's so interesting how we have changed as consumers of TV shows and the expectation that like we will have things readily available to us. But then there's some shows where, so if you don't mind me segueing, I've been watching The Last of Us.
Right.
Which is a HBO show. So HBO still do week-on-week release. So they still keep that kind of traditional release schedule and keep the audience kind of excited for it's counting down to the next episode, which I love. Like, as soon as it's available, I want to watch it, whatever is available to me.
Yeah, and sometimes I kind of set myself I'm going to wait till it's come out so that I can binge it and then don't make it.
Yeah,
2 or 3 episodes come out and I'm like, I need to watch it now.
So speaking of your approach to shows, I know you're a bit of a fan of it, and it's coming out in 2 weeks' time. The new Yellow Jackets starts in 2 weeks' time.
There were trailers for it at the Scream premiere.
Very good.
Very, very excited.
Yeah.
New inclusion of Elijah Wood this season.
So will you access it week on week, or will you wait until the season is finalised its drop?
You know what? I think I will wait.
Yeah.
And I say that
so I'm
because...
not allowed to talk to you about it for like 10 weeks.
Well, you could wait with me. It'd be cute. We'll share a nice little waiting party.
Very good.
The reason, specifically for Yellow Jackets, the reason is that the plot is quite complex at times. Mm-hmm. And I genuinely think if I am watching it on a weekly basis, I will be forgetting key parts of the plot that I will need to know in order to be like, wait, why is this happening?
But they're the one that does it previously on Yellow Jackets.
I know. But they're
too busy opening the corn chips at that point.
Exactly right. And I'm a very big corn chip enthusiast, so it's quite a noisy opening. I just think that their narrative is really, really dependent on drawing you in emotionally, and I feel like if I'm watching episode after episode, I will be more drawn into that.
Yeah.
Look, we'll see how I go. You might come in and be like, you got to see the first episode. It's amazing. And then you know what will happen. But what I could also do is I can bide my time by rewatching the first season in the lead up to the second season.
That's always a good thing to do because you are well versed with what the preceding season gave you so that you connect more with the story of the second season. There was another show that's coming up soon for its 4th season is Barry. So that's about a month or so away. I know you're a fan of that show as well. I will likely rewatch the first 3 seasons of Barry in the lead up to it because they're so easy to watch, so fun to watch. I have already rewatched Barry after experiencing it season on season when it first came out because I love that show so much. So expect me to talk about Barry next week to say that's what I watched this week. On
that note too, I mean, adding this segment in to talk about our own interests, I really like it. I think it's a good way for us to kind of share our interests. It also opens the opportunity for you guys to get in touch and share your interests as well. But it does obviously add time onto the podcast. So it'd be really, really good to get some feedback on whether you liked this as an inclusion, if you think it's a good inclusion, but you'd like it to present in a slightly different way. Maybe we could pick 2 or 3 of our favorite things of the week as opposed to whatever we watched. It's obviously going to vary from week to week depending on how much time we have.
Or maybe we just check ourselves for our tangents that we love to go on as film and TV enthusiasts.
This is the problem. Usually in a podcast scenario, when we go off on a tangent, you have one person that goes on the tangents and one person that reels them back in. But we have so much appreciation for what the other one is saying that we'll just let ourselves run wild.
And here's hoping our audience has the same appreciation.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've been doing it for the last 5 weeks now. So hopefully if you're back here on week 5 or 6, then it means that you must be liking something.
You know what I'm going to do right now? Let's put a code word in right at this point in the podcast so that we know that they've actually got to this point in the podcast. Code word is tomato.
Is that tomato or tomato?
Whatever way they want to present it. We'll call the whole thing off regardless.
That's good. I enjoyed that. Alrighty, so while we are talking about new segments and people getting involved, we're still looking for more suggestions for different segments we could do. As I said, we are hoping to do a countdown to our top films that we've looked at for the term. Stay tuned for that in a few weeks' time as well.
We have 5 films in, and I think we've got room for 3 more films this term.
Yes, but we may have something special up our sleeve
yes.
for the holiday period as well. So you'll have to stay tuned for that one.
Oh, the enticement. I love it. Yeah, very good.
We probably should wrap it up there. As always, I do really encourage you guys to like, subscribe. Please check out the channel as well. There's a lot of different videos there. You can look at the old podcast, but there's also a lot of shot-for-shot remakes of different films and music videos. Wit's cameos in a few of those with me as well. And some more like little short films and comedy shorts as well that you haven't stumbled upon before.
Well, on that note, you walk off into the sunset. You've got cartoons around you. You've got Dolores in your arm. And then a pig turns to the camera and says,
Yeah. That's all, folks.
See you next week, guys.
See you guys. Have a good one.